Hi, and welcome to Wealth Stories for Sleep.
Here, the idea is simple. While you sleep, you grow richer. We gently send messages of abundance straight into your subconscious through calm stories made to gently guide you to sleep.
It's late, isn't it? Maybe you're lying there, with the weight of the day still on your shoulders, or staring at the ceiling, imagining things only you can see. Wherever you are right now, whatever your heart feels, you're here. And that's all that matters. Close your eyes, if you'd like. Take a deep breath. This is a story to quiet your mind, to cradle your dreams. A story about something small, something that grows almost without you noticing. Welcome to this moment of peace. Here, stories are more than tales. They're like seeds planted in your mind as you rest. They speak of hope, of growth, of things that bloom in silence. Listen gently. Let the words flow. And, if you'd like, come back tomorrow. Because sometimes it's in repetition that things change. Once upon a time, in a village hidden among mist-covered mountains, there lived a man named Samuel. He wasn't wealthy, or famous, or even well-known. Samuel was a weaver, not the kind who made tapestries for kings or clothes for the rich. He wove simple blankets with wool he sheared from the sheep grazing in the hills. His house was small, with a single window that let in the silvery light of the moon. Samuel worked at an old spinning wheel, which turned with a soft creak, almost like a song. He blended the wool with threads of flax, sometimes with dried herbs he gathered at dawn. Each blanket had a special touch, something that made those who used it feel a warmth that went beyond the body. But the villagers didn't think much of it. They said Samuel's blankets were too plain, not fancy enough to impress. Still, Samuel kept on. He believed that a blanket, no matter how humble, could carry a story, a memory, a piece. One night, a woman named Clara came to Samuel's door. She looked tired, her shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of many days. Her hands trembled as she held a handful of coins. "I need something to keep me warm," she said. "Okay. Something to make me feel that everything will be all right." Samuel looked at her and asked no questions. He took a skein of soft wool, dyed with the colors of the sky at dusk, and began to weave. As he worked, he thought of the cold nights Clara might be facing, the worries keeping her awake. He wove with care, blending the wool with dried jasmine petals, which gave off a gentle scent. When he finished, he handed the blanket to Clara. "Use it when you need it," he said. "It will remind you that warmth always returns." Clara came back a few days later. Her eyes were lighter, as if she'd found some rest. "That blanket," she said, "made me sleep like I haven't in years. I don't know how, but it felt like he was holding me, even from so far away." She brought a basket of figs as thanks. Samuel smiled and placed the basket on a shelf already crowded with small gifts: a ripe apple, a loaf of homemade bread, a polished river stone. Slowly, the village began to change. People came to Samuel, one by one. A merchant who couldn't forget his debts, a grandmother who missed her distant grandchildren, a young man who dreamed of adventures but was afraid to leave. For each, Samuel wove a blanket. He listened to their stories, chose the wool carefully, sometimes blending in flower petals or shimmering threads that seemed to catch the light of the stars. Each blanket was more than fabric. It was a promise of comfort, a reminder that the cold doesn't last forever. Years passed, and Samuel's house was never empty. He didn't ask for much, sometimes nothing at all. But the gifts kept coming. A basket of walnuts, a pair of gloves for winter, a jar of golden honey, and, without him noticing, his life changed. His once simple, cold home now had a fireplace crackling with fresh wood, a chair where he rested at day's end, a window that glowed with morning sunlight. Samuel never sought riches. He never wanted fame, but in his own way, he was wealthy. Because every blanket he wove, every thread he intertwined, brought a little warmth to someone. And in the quiet of the village, as people slept wrapped in his blankets, Samuel knew that small things, done with care, build something greater than the world can measure. He kept working, even when his hair turned gray and his hands began to tremble. People came from far away now, from other villages, from distant cities, bringing stories of sleepless nights, heavy hearts, dreams that seemed lost. Samuel listened to each one with the same patience and wove a blanket for every story. A woman who had lost her son brought an old coin, asking for something to remind her of him. Samuel wove a blue blanket with threads that shimmered like the sky on a clear night, and handed it to her with a gentle smile. A traveler crossing the mountains asked for something to warm his lonely nights. Samuel chose wool dyed with the green of the hills and gave him a blanket that seemed to carry the scent of the earth. Each blanket was unique, made with a piece of Samuel's heart. And over time, Samuel's blankets came to be called star blankets. No one knew exactly why. Maybe because they glowed softly in the moonlight. Maybe because those who used them dreamed of bigger things, of horizons that seemed impossible. Or maybe because, when touching one of Samuel's blankets, people felt the sky was a little closer. When Samuel grew too old to weave, he sat in his chair by the fireplace and looked out at the village through his window. The houses glowed with soft lights, and he knew that in each one there was a Sorabactiartha blanket, warming someone. He closed his eyes, content, knowing his simple life had touched so many others. The gardener who planted dreams no one believed he lived at the edge of the village in a small house made of faded wood and silence. The garden behind it was always empty, just soil and wind. Yet every morning he walked into that emptiness carrying an old watering can and a basket full of seeds that no one recognized. The villagers had long stopped asking what he was doing. Years ago, they'd called him strange, whispered that he was chasing something that didn't exist. They'd seen him kneeling in the dirt under rain and sun, whispering words to the soil, like prayers only he could understand. Dreams, he once told a child who asked him what he was planting. But they take time to bloom, and not everyone sees them growing. The child laughed, but kindly, and ran off. Still, the gardener continued. His seeds weren't for food. They were not for flowers or trees. He planted ideas, hopes, quiet beliefs that something better could take root if tended every day. Even when no one was watching, the soil didn't resist. It accepted the offerings and the silence. Seasons passed. Nothing obvious grew. But inside the man, something changed. He started waking up lighter, more certain, even as the world called him a fool. One morning, a traveler passed by and asked why the garden looked empty. Because you're not looking with the right eyes, the gardener said. Try seeing what could be instead of what is. The traveler blinked, paused, then slowly smiled. That's rare, he said. Most people only believe in what they can count or touch. And yet, the gardener replied, everything worth building begins with something invisible. He offered the traveler a cup of water drawn from his well, and they sat on the edge of the dry soil, speaking of things neither of them had ever said out loud. It was that same week the first dream bloomed, not visibly, not with leaves or stems, but someone in the village suddenly remembered a story they once wanted to write and picked up a pen. Another began to fix the old mill just to see if it still worked. A child painted a door blue and said it looked like the sky. None of them thought of the gardener, but their steps grew lighter. The village slowly changed color. The soil in the back of the house remained as it was quiet and dark, but the gardener smiled more now. He still planted every morning, still whispered to the seeds, but now, sometimes someone walked by and stayed for a while. Sometimes they asked to borrow a handful of seeds. They're not mine to give, he would say, but if you're willing to believe, they'll find you. And every so often, when the stars were right and the wind paused to listen, a soft glow shimmered above the garden like breath, waiting to become words. Some said it was just coincidence, that people had always carried dreams, and the gardener had nothing to do with it. But those who passed by his house in the early hours noticed how the air shifted around him, how even the birds seemed to pause before landing near his soil. One day, a woman arrived carrying a box full of broken objects, a compass that didn't point north, a candle that refused to light, a notebook soaked in rain. She stood at the edge of the garden, unsure of what to do. The gardener looked up and nodded toward the ground. Place them there, he said. They're still holding stories. She looked puzzled, but obeyed. And when she returned a week later, she found tiny sprouts pushing through the earth where she had buried her disappointments. Not plants, but small symbols, one shaped like a key, another like a flame. She wept without understanding why. The gardener never explained. He only kept tending the soil, always gently, always with care. He spoke less now, not because he had grown tired, but because the garden had begun speaking for him. A man who had lost everything built a small bench near the gate and began offering tea to anyone who passed. A teenager who hadn't spoken in years painted a mural of stars across the town wall, saying only that she had dreamed it beside the gardener's fence. A boy placed a single feather on the soil and said, "For something to lift me." And months later, he began crafting wind chimes that sang like hope. People didn't talk about the garden in the market or in the square, but they began walking differently, listening longer, smiling softer. The village didn't become rich in gold or trade, but it became a place people wanted to stay. And the gardener, he simply continued. He aged, of course. His hair thinned, his hands trembled, but his eyes remained clear, as if they saw something growing that no one else could yet name. One night, the wind turned colder. The sky above the garden was heavy with clouds, and the stars were hidden. The gardener stood at the edge of his soil and whispered something softer than breath. Then he went inside and rested. He didn't wake. The next day, the village mourned him quietly, without fanfare. But on the morning after his passing, something impossible happened. The garden bloomed not with plants, but with thousands of soft lights rising from the ground like fireflies made of memory. Each one drifted toward a house, a door, a heart that had once received a seed. And in each of those homes, someone stood a little taller, believed a little deeper, began something they'd always postponed. No one tried to take the garden. No fences were built. No signs were raised. Instead, people came and sat at its edge. They brought feathers, broken things, ideas, and slowly, each one began planting something of their own. The soil still looked empty to those who didn't know, but those who had ever dared to believe saw it differently. They saw the garden for what it truly was, not just dreams, but a promise that what we plant in faith, no matter how invisible, always finds a way to bloom. The silent ticks of forgotten hours in a quiet village nestled between two slow-moving rivers. There lived an old man whose workshop always smelled faintly of oil, cedarwood, and thyme. He was not famous, nor rich, nor often remembered in town meetings, but almost every home in the village had a clock that once stopped and ticked again because of him. His hands, calloused and wrinkled, had the patience of someone who understood that not everything broken was meant to be thrown away. Some things simply needed attention. And so, people brought him clocks, wristwatches abandoned in drawers, dusty mantel clocks from attics, old wall clocks whose pendulums had gone still. And he received them all with the same nod, the same small smile, and the same quiet reverence. He never asked why the clock had stopped. He only listened, not to the people, but to the clocks, because he believed each one had a story to tell. The villagers often wondered why he never fixed clocks quickly. Some repairs would take days, even weeks. But what they didn't see was what he did in silence. He would place the clock on a linen cloth by the window under the afternoon sun and wait. He said time needed to remember itself. Only then would he begin. He didn't just repair gears and springs. He cleaned memories, polished regrets, adjusted the rhythm of what had been lost. There was a kindness in the way he worked, a belief that nothing was truly out of time. It hadn't found its moment again. The workshop had no signs, no prices. People paid with what they had: a jar of honey, a loaf of warm bread, a story from their childhood. And he accepted each one as if it were more precious than gold. One day, a young woman arrived from the city. Her watch had stopped ticking a year ago, but she didn't just want it fixed. She wanted to know why it had stopped on that specific day. He took the watch gently, held it close to his ear, and closed his eyes. Minutes passed. When he opened them, he simply said, "Because you forgot to listen to your own rhythm." She didn't understand at first, but as he cleaned the watch, she sat in the shop, listening to the ticking of other clocks. Tick, tock, tick. Each beat felt like a breath she hadn't taken in years. By the time her watch was returned, she didn't need to ask any more questions. She thanked him, left a sketch she had drawn at the shop, and walked away lighter. That night, the old man sat alone in the shop, surrounded by the steady ticking of all the repaired clocks, and he smiled. Not because he had fixed something, but because someone had remembered herself through the silence of time, the clock that had no hands as the seasons changed. The old man's work remained steady, but something in the air around the village began to shift. People who had once rushed past the workshop began to pause, if only to listen to the gentle ticking that spilled through its wooden walls. A child who had been gifted a broken toy clock by her grandfather came, not to fix it, but to ask if it could still dream. He took the toy, held it gently in his palms, and whispered, "Some clocks never needed to tell time. They only needed to be held." She smiled, and in that moment, something inside her became still and sacred. Word spread quietly, not as gossip, but as wonder. People began bringing not only clocks, but questions. Questions about their own rhythm, their pace, their forgotten dreams. And he listened, not with answers, but with presence. One evening, during a golden twilight, a stranger arrived, an older man with trembling hands and a large clock wrapped in worn cloth. It was unlike any the repairman had ever seen. The stranger unwrapped it carefully, revealing a clock with no hands, only a round face, weathered and silent. "This belonged to my father," the man said. "He said it was never broken, but I never understood it. Can you fix something that never told time?" The old repairman didn't speak. He simply took the clock into his hands and sat with it for hours. No tools, no light, only silence. The next morning, he returned the clock, still handless, still silent, but something in its presence felt complete. "This clock," he said, "was never meant to measure minutes. It was meant to remind its keeper that not everything important can be counted." The stranger wept not out of sadness, but from a release he hadn't known he needed. He left the shop that day without the clock, saying, "It belongs here, with you, where it can keep reminding others too." And so, the clock with no hands sat on a shelf beside a tiny bell that never rang, a compass that always pointed home, and a book whose pages turned themselves when no one was looking. The shop was full of things like that, objects that didn't just mark time, but invited those who entered to live it differently. One night, a great storm came to the village. Trees bent, windows rattled, and rivers roared. The next morning, villagers rushed to check on the repairman. They found the shop untouched, but the man was gone. Only a note remained, pinned to the largest clock in the room. It read, "My time has not ended. It has simply become quiet." From that day on, the workshop became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People entered not to fix what was broken, but to remember what had been forgotten, and every clock in the room still ticked. Some fast, some slow, one without hands, but all alive. It is said that if you enter the shop in silence and listen, not just with your ears, but with your soul, you might hear a voice whispering through the rhythm. You were never running out of time. You were learning to hear it. The gardener who planted dreams no one believed in there once was a man who arrived in a village that had forgotten the shape of color. Not literally, of course. There were still fields, trees, even flowers, but people had stopped noticing them. They passed each day like shadows, eyes lowered, voices faint, hearts heavy with a dullness that no one dared to name. The man carried no belongings besides a bag of withered seeds and a notebook tied with twine. He walked slowly, as if measuring the earth with each step, until he reached a patch of dry land at the edge of the village. It wasn't claimed by anyone. Nothing ever grew there. But the man, whose name no one asked, placed his seeds in the soil without permission, without announcement, and without certainty that they would grow. The villagers watched with mild amusement. Dreamer, someone muttered. Another said, "That's the cursed ground. Even weeds refuse to sprout there." But the man only smiled quietly, pressing one seed at a time into the dirt as if he were whispering secrets into the earth. Every morning, he returned to water the land. He hummed songs no one recognized and drew diagrams in his notebook that made no sense to anyone else. People started to visit the edge of the field, not out of support, but out of boredom or disbelief. "Still nothing," they'd report. "He's wasting water," another would scoff. "He could have used that time to build a shed or trade in town, at least something useful." But the man kept planting, not just seeds ideas. He began telling small stories to children who wandered by. Stories about trees that grew laughter and vines that listened to worries and turned them into poems. The stories weren't about getting rich. They were about noticing, about staying, about believing. And slowly, something changed. One morning, a sprout, tiny, almost invisible, but there, and then another. Not flowers yet, but the promise of them. The children were the first to notice. He wasn't lying, they cried. The ground is alive. The adults were slower, suspicious. They whispered theories. Maybe he used magic. Maybe he buried colored stones to fool them. But none of it mattered to the man. He watered, he waited, he smiled. As the plants grew, so did curiosity. People began asking him questions, not just about gardening, but about patience and why he never seemed tired. "Because I'm not chasing anything," he said once. "I'm just listening." They didn't understand, but they stayed a little longer each day. A woman brought him a new trowel. A boy offered his help digging. Someone left a loaf of bread by the field, and in return, the man began to teach not with commands, but with quiet observations. "Did you see how that seed curved toward the sun before it even broke the surface?" he'd ask. "That means something." "What?" a girl asked. "It means things can reach for light long before they know what light is." The garden, once invisible, became a space of reflection. Not a market, not a performance, just a place where growth was slow and undeniable. He started inviting villagers to write their dreams on scraps of paper and bury them near the roots of his plants, not to wish, but to believe, to participate. And still, he never promised results. He only promised that the act of planting would change something, if not the world, then the planter. As days turned to weeks, the field transformed, not into riches or rare herbs, but into a landscape of soft color, buzzing with bees, swaying with silent understanding. The man never claimed ownership. When asked what he wanted in return, he'd only say, "For you to water it when I'm gone." One day, he didn't show up. No one saw him leave. His notebook remained by the fence, open to a final page that read, "The soil remembers." And just like that, the village changed. Not overnight, not loudly, but gardens began sprouting. In windows, children asked more questions. Elders smiled more easily. And in the place where he once planted dreams no one believed in, people began planting their own. But something peculiar happened after the man's quiet disappearance. Though no one saw him leave, his presence lingered like dew on morning grass, subtle, glistening, undeniable. The garden he left behind didn't wither. In fact, it flourished more than ever. New blooms opened, that no one remembered planting. Colors deepened. A certain fragrance began to drift through the village at dusk, soft and warm, like bread baking or distant lullabies. Some said the man had never truly left. Others claimed he was never real to begin with, that he was just a story the village told itself when it forgot how to hope. But none of that stopped the seeds from growing. A young woman began sitting at the edge of the garden each evening, humming her own tunes now, watching the bees work, sketching dreams in her notebook. A father who once scoffed at the man's efforts now brought his daughter to tend the soil every weekend. Saying little, but staying long. No one appointed anyone to care for the garden. It didn't need rules or fences. It belonged to everyone. To no one. That was the miracle. It became a living story, one told through action, not words. Children no longer buried scraps of wishes alone. Adults began adding their own pieces of cloth, trinkets, messages written in trembling hands, each offering gently pressed beneath the roots, as if the earth itself was a keeper of secrets. On the day a great storm swept across the hills, the village feared the worst. Trees bent. Rain fell in thick sheets. The sky groaned and split. But the garden stood. In the morning, not a single stalk was broken. That was when they understood. The garden had roots deeper than they imagined. Not just in the soil, but in them. One elder, long silent and skeptical, said softly, "Maybe the man wasn't teaching us how to grow plants. Maybe he was showing us how to believe again, in things we can't see grow yet." And from then on, no one laughed at dreamers. In fact, the village slowly filled with them. A carpenter started building tiny shelves shaped like leaves. Bakers shaped bread into spirals that matched the garden's patterns. A quiet boy began drawing every plant in a giant book he called the Whispering Field. And the phrase "that won't work here" began to disappear from conversations. In its place came curiosity. What if it does? The field expanded not by borders, but by hearts. And whenever someone asked, why did he plant on cursed land, the answer came softly, because only barren places are hungry enough to welcome miracles. One autumn, a vine grew around the gatepost that no one remembered placing. Its flowers glowed faintly in the moonlight. Some villagers began calling it the listening vine, saying that when you sat near it, the thoughts you hadn't said aloud began to soften. Whether it was magic or memory, no one could prove, but they didn't need to. What mattered was how it made them feel. And so, years passed. The garden remained. Some things changed. New people moved in. Others passed on. The children who once listened to the man's stories grew up and told their own. But one thing never changed. The garden kept receiving dreams and returning something softer, deeper, and more lasting in return. One evening, a small girl asked her grandmother, what was the gardener's name? The old woman paused, smiled, and whispered, he never told us. I think he wanted us to name him ourselves through how we chose to live. And as stars blinked awake above them, and the leaves rustled like pages of a book still being written, the little girl nodded. In her eyes, there was already the shape of a seed, one that might grow into something no one else believed in, until she did. The man who repaired clocks that no longer ticked in a quiet corner of a town that most maps forgot stood a shop that looked more like a memory than a business. Its windows were fogged with dust and time, and its sign, carved long ago, simply read, time restored. Inside, clocks of all kinds lined the walls, grandfather clocks, tall as trees, pocket watches sleeping in velvet, cuckoo clocks whose birds hadn't sung in decades. And behind the counter sat a man whose hands moved, slower than most, but never shook. His name was Elliot, though most had forgotten that too. He wore a coat patched at the elbows and glasses that slipped down his nose, but his eyes were sharp, not with urgency, but with knowing. Elliot didn't repair clocks for money, at least not anymore. People came to him with clocks they found in attics or inherited from great-aunts, clocks that no longer ticked, clocks that hadn't mattered to anyone for years. But Elliot never turned them away. He'd take the clock gently, examine it like a story waiting to be read, then set it on his bench. "We'll find your time again," he'd whisper, not just to the clock, but to the one who brought it. That was the part no one talked about. People didn't come to Elliot only to fix timepieces. They came because something inside them felt stuck to. There was the woman who hadn't written a song in 10 years and brought in her father's old metronome. The man who'd left his career behind but couldn't move forward, carrying a broken station clock under his arm. And the child who refused to speak after a loss, clutching a plastic wristwatch that had stopped on the very day her world changed. Elliot never asked why they brought what they brought. He simply listened with his hands. As he worked, time slowed, not just in the ticking of the shop, but in the hearts of those who sat nearby, waiting. They would watch him place each tiny gear, clean the dust, realign what was never quite brokenly forgotten. And when the clock ticked again, it was as if something else inside them did too. One evening, just before closing, a young man arrived with no clock at all. He stood quietly, hesitant. Elliot looked up and asked, "What time have you lost?" The young man said, "I don't know. I just feel like I missed something, like everyone else has moved on and I'm still standing still." Elliot nodded, slowly, then offered a stool. He handed the man a small, silent pocket watch. "This one hasn't spoken in years," Elliot said. "Why don't you keep it company while I finish this?" So the young man sat, and for an hour, he said nothing. But when he finally left, the pocket watch in his palm gave a soft click, as if acknowledging him. And that night, he wrote the first chapter of a book he'd abandoned 5 years before. Stories like that never made the papers. But in town, people started calling Elliot the keeper of lost time. Not because he held it, but because he reminded people they still had it. He never claimed to fix lives, but he offered something quieter, the permission to begin again, no matter how late it felt. As the years passed, Elliot's little shop became more than a place to mend broken gears. It became a quiet sanctuary for those who felt out of sync with the world. Some came with stories, others came with silence, but all of them carried a kind of ticking that only he could hear. There was an old painter who had lost the use of his dominant hand, convinced his art was behind him. He brought in a sundial, cracked in two, unsure why. Elliot never asked. He simply placed the pieces gently on the counter and began to smooth the fracture, not with glue, but with attention. The painter returned days later, not for the sundial but to show Elliot his first attempt painting with his other hand. It was messy, uneven, but radiant. Elliot smiled and said, "Only, you're not late. You're just right on time." One winter, a young woman who had just turned 30 entered, carrying a clock shaped like a carousel. "My grandmother gave me this when I was 5, she whispered. "It stopped the day she passed." Elliot took the carousel clock into his hands, turning it slowly, as if listening for a forgotten song. For days, he worked on it, not because it was complex, because he wanted to make sure it turned gently again. When he finally handed it back, the music played one soft note, then another, and her eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed herself in years. "She'd be proud of who you are now," Elliot said, as if he knew more than she'd told him. Word spread that the clocks Elliot restored didn't just start ticking, they helped people start over. No one understood how. Perhaps it was the silence of the shop, or the patience in his hands. Or perhaps it was that Elliot never tried to hurry time. He let it unfold, gear by gear, tick by tick. One day, the town woke to find the shop closed for the first time in decades. The windows were dark. A note on the door, written in Elliot's careful hand, read, "Gone to find a clock of my own." For weeks, people came by, hoping to see him, sitting at the counter, polishing time. But the shop remained closed. Some believed he had finally taken a rest. Others said he was visiting all the clocks he'd restored, one by one, checking that they still remembered how to tick. Eventually, the mayor declared the shop a place of heritage, not for its age, but for what it gave. A quiet exhibit opened, filled with clocks that Elliot had fixed. But what drew the visitors weren't the timepieces, it was the letters left behind. Hundreds of them. Notes, stories, confessions, thank yous, taped inside clock casings, hidden beneath drawers, tucked into coat pockets. Messages from people Elliot had never asked to write, but who had felt compelled to say something once their own time began again. One read, "You reminded me that I wasn't too late to fall in love." Another, "Thank you for fixing the part of me that forgot how to dream." And another, simple but true, "You made me believe time wasn't my enemy." Years later, a young girl inherited the shop. She was Elliot's great-niece, though few knew that. She hadn't met him until she was 10, when her parents brought her to meet the quiet man who had once fixed her music box. Elliot had handed her a tiny gear that day and said, "Sometimes the smallest pieces hold everything together." She'd kept it ever since. Now, she reopened the shop not to fix time, but to remind others they still had it. The sign remained the same, time restored. And if you stepped inside, you might hear a soft ticking not just of clocks, but of hearts learning to trust their own rhythm again. The walls still held the sound of Elliot's silence, the kind that never pressured, never rushed, but always believed in second chances. And if you looked closely, behind the counter, in a drawer no one thought to open, was a pocket watch that had stopped many years ago. Next to it, a note in Elliot's handwriting. "Time is never lost, only waiting to be noticed again." The gardener who planted dreams no one believed in a quiet valley, far from the noise of cities and the rush of expectations, there lived a man who had never planted anything anyone believed in. His name was never recorded in books, and his home, a crooked wooden cottage surrounded by dry earth and wild silence. had never been visited by travelers or praised by poets. But he had one thing most people had forgotten how to carry: an unshakable belief in unseen things. Every morning before the sun painted the sky, he walked barefoot through his small patch of land, whispering to the soil, touching the dust with fingers that had no proof, only faith. He didn't plant food or flowers. Instead, he buried things, like ideas, hopes, and what he called dream seeds, invisible to the eye, but very real to his heart. The villagers called him odd. Some said he was lost. Others said he was cursed to loneliness. Yet he kept planting, season after season, in silence, without asking for approval or applause. His neighbors came and went, harvesting corn, selling cattle, building fences, but the man stayed. He watched the wind, the way the shadows moved, and listened to the silence as if it were an ancient friend. One morning, a child wandered onto his land, curious. "What are you growing?" she asked, looking around at what seemed like barren ground. He smiled, knelt down, and pointed. "Dreams," he said softly. "They take longer than tomatoes." The child giggled and ran off, but she came back the next day, and the next. Slowly, others followed. A widow who had forgotten how to sing, a boy with broken shoes who wanted to build things, a girl who spoke only in drawings. They came and sat on the edge of the garden, not expecting much. Yet, when they left, something had shifted in them. They didn't understand it at first, just a feeling, like a light warming. The corner of a cold room. The gardener never explained. He simply offered water and silence, and still nothing visible grew. No stalks, no blossoms, only bare earth and footprints of those who came with questions and left with softer hearts. One winter, a great storm came through the valley. Trees fell, roofs shattered, and many gardens were lost. But his land remained untouched, as if protected by the very dreams he had buried. That spring, something unusual happened. A faint shimmer spread across his field at dawn, like dew made of light. Where the villagers saw only emptiness before, they now saw patterns in the soil, like invisible seeds finally drawing outlines. Not plants, not crops, but something deeper. Paths began to form gentle trails that led people back to their forgotten passions. A woman who once wrote poems as a child began to write again. A man who had closed his bakery reopened it and baked bread that made people cry. A boy who had stopped speaking began humming tunes that healed, and no one knew why, except the gardener. He simply kept walking his land, watering the invisible, tending to the impossible. Some said he had magic. Others believed he had found a way to speak with the soul of the earth. But he never claimed anything. He only said, dreams just need someone who stays long enough for them to feel safe to grow. And slowly, people started planting differently, not just for food, but for healing, for hope, for things that couldn't be measured in coin or fame. His garden, still quiet and simple, became a place of return, not of escape, but of remembering. And every seed buried in silence echoed something much louder in the heart of those who passed through. Seasons passed, and the gardener grew older. His hair turned the color of snow, and his hands moved slower, but his eyes held the same quiet fire they always had. Visitors still came, some seeking answers, others simply needing a place where silence didn't feel like loneliness. They walked, among the invisible paths, breathed the stillness, and left with something they hadn't arrived, with a sense that their lives, even if unnoticed, carried meaning. One evening, as the sky bled into gold and violet, a young man approached the gardener. He was restless, carrying a notebook filled with unfinished plans. "I've tried everything," he confessed. "Worked hard, studied, applied every formula, but nothing grows." The gardener offered him tea and listened. When the young man finished speaking, the old man nodded. "Did you ever just believe?" he asked. The young man hesitated. "Believe? In what?" "In the possibility," the gardener said, "that something can come from what looks like nothing." The young man laughed, but not mockingly, more like someone remembering a forgotten song. He stayed the night, and in the morning, he helped the gardener walk the land. "What are we doing?" he asked. "Showing the earth we're still here," the gardener replied. Later that day, the young man wrote in his notebook, not a plan, but a feeling. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel behind. He felt exactly where he needed to be. Elsewhere, stories of the garden began to spread, not as legends, but as whispers. People spoke of how they left lighter, as if something unseen had been lifted from their shoulders. No signs were placed, no brochures, yet the garden became a place where the wounded and weary came to rest. A woman who had lost everything sat by the old well for hours and left with the courage to begin again. A father who hadn't hugged his son in years returned home and simply said, "I missed you." A teacher, burnt out and bitter, came for a moment of silence and returned to her class with new eyes. And still, the gardener asked for nothing. He only gave water to the invisible and time to the forgotten. One day, the child who once asked him about tomatoes returned, now a woman with her own small piece of land. She brought her daughter and said, "I wanted her to see where dreams grow." The gardener smiled. His voice, softer now, whispered, "They grow wherever someone dares to believe before they see." The woman cried, not because she was sad, but because something finally made sense. As years passed, others began gardens of their own. Not replicas, but places inspired by what they felt. Some wrote, some built, some simply listened. But each, in their own way, planted what others had abandoned: dreams, trust, softness. And in the center of it all, the original garden stood. No signs of wealth, no trophies. Just soft earth, silent paths, and stories imprinted in the wind. Gardener's time came. There was no ceremony. Just a morning mist, bird songs, and a breeze that carried his name like a blessing. His cottage remained, cared for by those who had once come broken and left whole. No one tried to fill his shoes. They simply walked the paths he had made, watered the silence, and listened for the next invisible seed. The world outside kept rushing, measuring, demanding. But here, in this valley of impossible dreams, time bent gently toward meaning. And still, if you visit the place at dawn, when the light is quiet and the earth still breathes in sleep, you might feel something stir beneath your feet. Not a plant, not a root, but a dream, long planted, waiting for someone like you to believe just enough for it to grow. The teller of rivers in an old village, where fields stretched to the horizon and the sound of a stream echoed like a forgotten song, lived a man named Elias. He wasn't wealthy or famous or even much of a talker. Elias was a teller of rivers, not the kind who drew maps or explored distant lands. He walked along the banks of the village's streams, watching the water, counting its curves, its stones, its hidden stories. His house was small, with a tiled roof and a door that creaked in the wind. Elias went out every morning with a notebook of yellowed pages and a worn pencil, and wrote down what he saw. The way the water danced over a rock, the glint of a stone wet by the sun, the murmur of the stream as it met a bend. He didn't count to measure or control, but to understand, as if each river held a secret only he could hear. The villagers thought it was strange. "Why count rivers?" they said. "The water passes and doesn't return." But Elias just smiled and kept on. He believed that a river, no matter how simple, carried a memory, a lesson, a piece of peace. One morning, a woman named Mariana came to Elias's house. She looked exhausted, her eyes full of an unspoken sadness. "My life feels like a knot," she said. "I can't find a clear path. Can you help me?" Elias looked at her and took his notebook. He led her to a nearby stream, where the water flowed slowly, and pointed to a gentle curve. "See how the river moves around this stone," he said. "It doesn't fight, it just flows. I'll tell this river for you." He sat on the bank and described every detail, the way the water embraced the stones, the reflection of the sky on the surface, the soft sound that seemed to sing. When he finished, he gave Mariana a page from his notebook with his words. "Read this when you feel lost," he said. "The river will show you the way." Mariana returned days later. Her voice was lighter, as if she'd found a bit of clarity. "Those words," she said, "made me hear the river even from so far away. I don't know how, but I feel I can move forward." She brought a basket of peaches as thanks. Elias accepted and placed the basket on a shelf already crowded with small gifts. A loaf of herb bread, a smooth stream stone, a hand-woven cloth. Slowly, the village began to change. People came to Elias, one by one. A carpenter who couldn't stop thinking about work. An old woman who missed her husband who had passed. A young man who dreamed of journeys but was afraid to start. For each, Elias told a river. He listened to their stories, walked to a stream, and described what he saw. The curve of a river that seemed to dance, the glint of a stone under moonlight, the sound of the water that seemed to whisper hope. For a mother worried about her children, Elias told of a wide river with banks that seemed to embrace the earth. For a merchant weighed down by debts, he described a swift stream that flowed without looking back. Years passed, and Elias's house was never empty. He didn't ask for much, sometimes nothing at all. But the gifts kept coming. A jar of honey, a pair of gloves for winter, a basket of fresh walnuts. His house, once simple and cold, now had a fireplace warming the nights, a table full of fruit and bread, a window glowing with morning sunlight. Elias never sought riches. He never wanted fame. But in his own way, he was wealthy. Because every river he told, every story he described, brought a bit of peace to someone. And in the quiet of the village, as people read his notes, Elias knew that small things, done with care, build something greater than the world can measure. He kept telling rivers, even when his hair turned white and his hands began to tremble. People came from far away now, from other villages, from distant cities, bringing stories of sleepless nights, heavy hearts, dreams that seemed lost. Elias listened to each one with the same patience and told a river for every story. A man who had lost his sister brought an old coin, asking for something to remind him of her. Elias took him to a calm stream and described how the water formed. Gentle swirls, as if dancing with memories, and gave him the notes. A traveler crossing the fields asked for something to calm her restless soul. Elias told of a deep river with banks full of wild herbs, and gave her a page with words that seemed to sing with the water. Each river story was unique, written with a piece of Elias's heart. Over time, Elias's notes came to be called river tales. No one knew exactly why. Maybe because the words flowed like water, carrying worries away. Maybe because those who read them dreamed of bigger things, of paths that seemed impossible. Or maybe because, when reading one of Elias's tales, people felt the current was closer. When Elias grew too old to walk to the streams, he sat in a wooden chair near his window and looked at the village. The fields glowed with a reflection of water, and he knew that in each house there was a page of his guiding someone. His life, so simple, had touched so many others. The weaver of dreams in a serene village, where the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the hills glowed under the silvery moonlight, lived a man named Anselm. He wasn't wealthy or famous or even much of a talker. Anselm was a weaver of dreams, not the kind who crafted grand stories or visions for kings. He worked with invisible threads, which he said he found in the air, and wove them into gentle thoughts that he offered to people. His home was humble, with mud walls and a window that framed the starry sky. Anselm sat every night in a wooden chair under the light of a lamp, and moved his hands as if he could weave the air itself, creating dreams that seemed to float in the minds of those who received them. He used no loom, no needle, just slow gestures, as if dancing with the silence. The villagers thought it was strange. "Why weave dreams?" they said. "They vanish at dawn." But Anselm just smiled and kept on. He believed that a dream, no matter how fleeting, could plant a seed, soothe a heart, change a day. On a full moon night, a woman named Teresa came to Anselm's house. She looked exhausted, her eyes heavy with an unrest she didn't explain. "My sleep is empty," she said. "I see nothing but darkness. Can you help me?" Anselm looked at her and made a slow gesture with his hands, as if pulling threads from the sky. He wove a dream of a lavender field, where the breeze blew gently and the sun warmed the skin. When he finished, he said to Teresa, "Close your eyes tonight and let this dream find you. It will take you somewhere peaceful." Teresa returned days later. Her voice was lighter, as if she'd found some rest. "That dream," she said, "made me smell lavender, even from so far away. I don't know how, but I felt my father with me. Like in the old days, she brought a basket of freshly baked bread as thanks." Anselm accepted and placed the basket on a shelf already crowded with small gifts: a shiny apple, a smooth river stone, a hand-embroidered cloth. Slowly, the village began to change. People came to Anselm, one by one. A blacksmith who couldn't stop thinking about work. An old woman who missed her children who had left. A young man who dreamed of love but was afraid to open his heart. For each, Anselm wove a dream. He listened to their stories, moved his hands carefully, creating images that seemed to dance in the mind. For a merchant worried about the future, Anselm wove a dream of a golden horizon where the sun never set. For a girl afraid of the dark, he created a dream of shooting stars, shining in an endless sky. Years passed, and Anselm's house was never empty. He didn't ask for much, sometimes nothing at all. But the gifts kept coming. A jar of wild honey, a pair of boots for winter, a basket of fresh fruit. His home, once simple and cold, now had a fireplace warming the nights, a table full of breads and fruits, a window glowing with morning sunlight. Anselm never sought riches. He never wanted fame. But in his own way, he was wealthy, because every dream he wove, every image he created, brought a bit of peace to someone. And in the quiet of the village, as people slept under their imaginary stars, Anselm knew that small things, done with care, built something greater than the world can measure. He kept weaving, even when his hair turned white and his hands began to tremble. People came from far away now, from other villages, from distant cities, bringing stories of sleepless nights, heavy hearts, hopes that seemed lost. Anselm listened to each one with the same patience and wove a dream for every story. A woman who had lost her brother brought an old coin, asking for something to remind her of him. Anselm wove a dream of a calm river with banks full of flowers, and told her to see it when she closed her eyes. A traveler crossing the hills asked for something to soothe his restless soul. Anselm created a dream of a silent forest, where the trees seemed to whisper secrets. Each dream was unique, woven with a piece of Anselm's heart. Over time, Anselm's dreams came to be called floating dreams. No one knew exactly why. Maybe because they felt light, as if they danced in the mind before fading away. Maybe because those who dreamed them imagined bigger things, horizons that seemed impossible. Or maybe because, when dreaming one of Anselm's dreams, people felt the sky was closer. When Anselm grew too old to weave, he sat in a wooden chair near his window and looked at the village. The nights glowed with the echo of his dreams, and he knew that in each house there was someone sleeping under an imaginary sky, finding a bit of peace. His life, so simple, had touched so many others. Roteiroi, the weaver of stars Ingles in a forgotten village atop a hill, where the wind sang softly and mist curled around stone houses, lived Elias, a man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 nights. He wasn't like the others who chased crops or shining coins. Elias spent his days gazing at the sky as if searching for a secret hidden in the clouds. At night, beneath a gnarled oak, he sat on a worn wooden chair, his eyes fixed on the stars, so bright, so distant, as if they whispered something only he tried to hear. Elias was a weaver, but not of wool or linen. He dreamed of weaving stars, stitching their light into something that could warm hearts, even on the coldest nights. How do you weave something so untouchable? He didn't know, but every night he tried, with a bone needle and an imaginary thread, sewing the sky in silence. The villagers laughed, called him a foolish dreamer. "Come back to earth, Elias," they said. "Stars aren't for men like us." But he didn't listen, continuing night after night with the wind as his only friend. One night, when the moon was just a silver thread, something changed. A star fell, not like the shooting stars that streak and vanish, but a real star, radiant, warm, landing on the hill like a glowing stone. Elias ran to it, his heart pounding like drums. It was small, the size of an apple, but pulsed with living light. He held it gently, feeling its warmth. And then it spoke. "Elias, why do you persist in weaving the sky?" He hesitated, then answered, "Because I believe stars can heal, can bring light to those who see only darkness." The star glowed brighter, as if smiling. "Then I'll teach you," it said. "But weaving stars is weaving hope, and hope requires patience." From that night on, the star guided Elias. It taught him to use threads of moonlight, fine as spider silk, and needles made of forgotten dreams. He learned to stitch constellations, not just to adorn the sky, but to create cloaks of light that warmed souls. Each stitch was slow, deliberate, as if time itself paused to listen. He wove memories of old laughter, quiet nights, promises made under the sky, and slowly, the village began to change. People, once weary and hollow-eyed, felt something new. A woman who'd lost her child said she felt him smiling when she looked at the sky. An old sailor, worn by storms, found peace in Elisa's constellations. The weaver didn't stop. Night after night, he climbed the hill, sat beneath the oak, and continued his work. Sometimes the star returned, whispering new lessons. "Each thread you weave," it said, "is a piece of hope you give the world." Elias smiled, his hands now lighter, his heart fuller. He sought no wealth or fame, only the certainty that somewhere someone slept better because of his light. And so, the nights grew softer, the sky closer, and the village, once so silent, began to dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same calm. Elias's stars still shine, up there, sown with patience and love. Close your eyes. Let the hill's breeze cradle you, and know that, as you sleep, the world within you is already changing. The seamstress of the river, in a hidden valley, where a silver river wound through hills draped in wild herbs, lived Amara, a woman with soft hands and eyes that gleamed like the water's reflection under moonlight. She wasn't like the others in the village, who busied themselves with the clamor of markets or the weight of daily tasks. Amara spent her days by the river's edge, sitting on a smooth stone, listening to the current's murmur, as if the river told stories only she could hear. At night, when the sky became a velvet cloak studded with stars, she took her silver needle and a spool of thread that seemed to glow with its own light, and began to sew. These weren't ordinary clothes Amara made, but tapestries that seemed to capture pieces of the world, a bird's song, the scent of rain, the warmth of a forgotten embrace. Each stitch she made was slow, as if dancing with time itself. The villagers called her a dreamer, said her tapestries were useless, that no one would buy woven memories. "Amara, come back to reality," they whispered, chuckling among themselves. But she only smiled, her fingers still guiding the needle, while the river sang in the background. One night, as mist rose from the valley and the stars seemed closer, something extraordinary happened. The river, always flowing gently, began to shimmer, its waters glinting as if carrying pieces of the sky. Amara, curious, dipped her hands into the current and felt something alive, warm, as if the river had a heart. Then a voice echoed, not loud, but deep, as if rising from the earth's depths. Amara, why do you sow what no one sees? She took a deep breath, the cool breeze brushing her face, and answered, because I believe memories can heal, that each thread I weave can bring peace to those lost in darkness. The river seemed to laugh, its water swirling in tiny eddies. Then I'll give you a gift, the voice said. But no, weaving with my thread takes courage, for it carries the dreams of all who've touched my waters. That night, the river gave Amara a golden thread, so fine it seemed made of liquid light. She held it with reverence, feeling the weight of 1,000 stories. From then on, her tapestries changed. Each stitch brought visions, a mother singing to her child, a traveler finding home, a broken heart mending. She sewed with patience under the moonlight while the river whispered ancient secrets. Slowly, the village began to change. A man who'd lost hope came to Amara and, touching one of her tapestries, remembered his childhood laughter and wept for the first time in years. A young woman, weary from sleepless nights, wrapped herself in one of Amara's creations and dreamed of a field of flowers she'd never seen. The tapestries weren't just beautiful, they were alive, filled with warmth and comfort. Amara didn't stop. Day after day, night after night, she sat by the river, her needle dancing, the golden thread glowing. Sometimes the river spoke again, teaching her to weave deeper dreams, older memories. Each thread you use, the voice said, is a piece of light you give back to the world. Amara smiled, her eyes now lighter, her heart brimming with quiet joy. She sought no gold or glory, only the certainty that her tapestries warm someone, somewhere, on a cold night. And so, the valley became a place of dreams, where the river sang, the stars shone brighter, and the people, once so heavy, began to find peace. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same softness of the river. Amara's tapestries still hang in the sky, woven with love and patience. Close your eyes, let the current cradle you, and know that, as you drift into sleep, the world within you is already transforming. The keeper of the Lantern Inn, a quiet coastal hamlet, where the sea whispered secrets to the cliffs and the air carried the scent of salt and wildflowers, lived Nora, a woman with weathered hands and eyes that held the depth of twilight. She was different from the others, who filled their days with nets and fish or the clatter of market stalls. Nora spent her hours wandering the shore, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea kissed the sky. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the waves in shades of amber, she climbed a winding path to a lighthouse perched on a jagged cliff. It wasn't a lighthouse like the ones that guided ships. Its lantern glowed with a strange, soft light that seemed to hum as if alive. Nora was its keeper, not of ships, but of something gentler, something unseen. She polished the lantern's glass, its surface warm under her touch, and lit it each night, letting its glow spill across the sea. The villagers called her fanciful, said her lantern was useless, that it let nothing but empty waves. Nora, tend to practical things, they'd mutter, shaking their heads. But she only smiled, her fingers tracing the lantern's curves, while the tide sang its endless song. One dusk, when the sky was streaked with violet and the air felt heavy with coming rain, something stirred. The lantern flared brighter than ever, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. Nora leaned close, and a voice, soft as the foam on the shore, spoke from within. "Nora, why do you light me each night?" She paused, the wind tugging at her hair, and answered, "Because I believe your light can mend what's broken, can guide hearts lost in the dark." The lantern's glow softened, as if nodding. "Then I'll share my secret," it said. "But no, my light carries the wishes of those who've stood here before. And to share it, you must give a piece of your own heart." That night, the lantern gifted Nora a spark, a tiny ember that felt like holding a warm star. She cradled it, feeling whispers of forgotten hopes, laughter from children's long grown, dreams of sailors who'd returned home, promises made under moonlit tides. With the ember, she began to weave light into the night, not just from the lantern, but from her own quiet strength. Each evening, she climbed the path, lit the lantern, and let its glow carry those wishes across the sea. Slowly, the hamlet changed. A fisherman, worn by years of empty nets, saw the lantern's light and remembered a song his mother sang, finding strength to cast again. A widow, heavy with grief, stood on the shore under its glow and felt, for a moment, her husband's hand. In hers, the light wasn't just bright. It was warm, alive with care and memory. Nora never tired. Night after night, she tended the lantern, her hands steady, her heart open. Sometimes the voice returned, teaching her to weave new wishes into the light hopes for peace, for rest, for new beginnings. "Each spark you share," it said, "is a gift to the world." Nora's eyes grew softer, her soul lighter, knowing her work touched hearts she'd never meet. She sought no praise, only the quiet joy of seeing the hamlet's faces lift, their steps grow surer. And so, the cliffs stood taller, the seas sank sweeter, and the people, once so burdened, began to dream again. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle glow. Nora's lantern still burns, high on the cliff, its light woven with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the waves carry you, and know that, as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already softening, already healing. The painter of whispers in a forgotten meadow where tall grasses swayed like waves and fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns. Lived Ilawan, a woman with gentle hands and eyes that shimmered like dew in the morning light. She wasn't like the villagers nearby who filled their days with chatter and chores, their lives bound by the rhythm of the harvest. Alawan spent her hours in the meadow, sitting on a weathered blanket, her fingers dipped in paints that seemed to glow with colors no one else could name. She painted not on canvas, but on the air itself, her brush strokes leaving fleeting trails of light that danced and faded like dreams. Each stroke was slow, deliberate, as if she were coaxing secrets from the wind. The villagers called her strange, said her paintings were pointless, vanishing before anyone could hold them. Ilawan, paint something real, they'd scoff, turning back to their fields, but she only smiled, her brush moving softly, while the meadow hummed with a quiet song. One twilight, when the sky was a tapestry of pink and gold, and the air smelled of honeysuckle, something shifted. The meadow grew still, the grasses barely stirring, and a whisper curled around Ilawan, soft as a sigh. It wasn't the wind, but something older, deeper, like the voice of the earth itself. Ilawan, why do you paint what fades? She paused, her brush hovering, and answered, because I believe these colors can heal, can carry hope to hearts that have forgotten how to feel. The whisper grew warmer, as if pleased. Then I'll lend you my colors, it said. But no, they hold the dreams of everyone who's walked this meadow, and painting with them asks for your trust. That evening, the meadow gave Ilawan a palette of hues that shimmered like liquid starlight, blues deep as midnight, golds warm as a hearth, greens that pulsed like spring. She dipped her brush, feeling stories flow through her. A child's forgotten laughter, a traveler's longing for home, a lover's unspoken promise. With each stroke, she painted scenes that lingered longer than before, fields of glowing flowers, rivers of light, skies filled with wings. The meadow seemed to breathe with her, its grasses swaying to her rhythm. Slowly, the village began to change. A farmer, weary from endless toil, wandered into the meadow and saw Ilawan's fading colors, feeling a spark of joy he hadn't known since youth. A young girl, afraid of the dark, watched the painted lights and slept soundly for the first time. In months, Ilawan's paintings weren't just beautiful. They were alive, carrying warmth and memory to those who saw them. She never stopped. Day after day, twilight after twilight, she returned to the meadow, her brush dancing, her colors glowing brighter. Sometimes the whisper returned, guiding her to paint deeper dreams, softer hopes. Each stroke you make, it said, is a gift of light to the world. Ilawan's heart grew lighter, her hands steadier, knowing her work touched souls she'd never meet. She sought no reward, only the quiet certainty that her paintings eased someone's burden, somewhere in the stillness of night. And so the meadow bloomed with unseen colors. The fireflies danced brighter, and the villagers, once so hurried, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle glow of Ilawan's colors. Her paintings still linger, floating in the air, woven with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the meadow's breeze cradle you, and know that, as you slip into sleep, the world within you is already softening, already growing brighter. Asterisk, the gardener of Donnan, a secluded valley where mist hung low and wildflowers bloomed. In colors that seemed to hum, lived Soren, a man with gentle hands and eyes that glowed like the first light of morning. He was unlike the villagers in the nearby town, who filled their days with the clink of coins and the bustle of trade. Soren spent his hours in a garden hidden behind ivy-covered walls, tending to plants that no one else knew how to name. His garden wasn't like others, filled with ordinary roses or cabbages. His flowers seemed to shimmer, their petals catching light in ways that made the air feel softer. Each morning, as the sky blushed with dawn, Soren walked among them, his fingers brushing their leaves, whispering words that sounded like songs. He planted seeds not just in soil, but in the quiet hopes of the world, as if each bloom could carry a wish. The townsfolk called him odd, said his garden was a waste, that flowers couldn't feed or clothe anyone. Soren, grow something useful, they'd grumble, turning back to their work. But he only smiled, his hands deep in the earth, while the valley sighed with a gentle breeze. One dawn, when the horizon glowed like molten gold and the air was thick with the scent of dew, something changed. A single flower in Soren's garden, smaller than the rest, began to pulse with a light that felt alive, its petals trembling as if breathing. Soren knelt beside it, and a voice, soft as the rustle of leaves, spoke from within. Soren, why do you plant what no one sees? He paused. The morning mist cooled against his skin, and answered, because I believe these flowers can mend, can carry peace, two hearts too heavy to rest. The flower's light grew warmer, as if it understood. Then I'll share my gift, it said. But no, my seeds hold the hopes of all who've walked this valley, and planting them asks for your faith. That morning, the flower gave Soren a handful of seeds, tiny as grains of sand, each one glowing faintly like a captured star. He held them close, feeling whispers of forgotten dreams, child's wish for adventure, a mother's prayer for safety, a wanderer's longing for rest. With these seeds, Soren began to plant anew, scattering them under the dawn's light, each one sinking into the earth with a sigh. His garden grew brighter, its flowers blooming in colors that seemed to sing blues that soothed, reds that warmed, whites that felt like home. Slowly, the town began to change. A merchant worn by years of worry passed Soren's garden and breathed in the scent of a glowing bloom, feeling his burdens lift like mist in the sun. A boy, scared of the future, sat among the flowers and dreamed of a path he hadn't dared imagine. Soren's garden wasn't just beautiful, it was alive, its blooms carrying hope and comfort to those who lingered. Soren never wavered. Dawn after dawn, he tended his garden, Antoine, planting, whispering, watching the flowers grow. Sometimes, the voice returned, teaching him to sow deeper hopes, brighter dreams. Each seed you plant, it said, is a spark of peace you give the world. Soren's heart grew lighter, his hands more certain, knowing his flowers touched lives he'd never see. He sought no riches, only the quiet joy of knowing his garden eased someone's heart, somewhere, in the stillness of dawn. And so, the valley bloomed with light, the flowers sang softly, and the townsfolk, once so restless, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle glow of Soren's flowers. His garden still grows, hidden in the valley, its blooms woven with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the dawn's breeze carry you, and know that, as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already blooming, already healing. The collector of echoes in a misty forest, where ancient trees stretched toward a sky veiled in silver, and the air carried the scent of moss and memory, lived Lyrian, a woman with quiet hands and eyes that gleamed like moonlight on still water. She was unlike the woodcutters and weavers of the nearby village, who filled their days with axes and looms, their lives bound by the hum of labor. Lyrian wandered the forest's shadowed paths, her steps soft on the earth, her ears attuned to the faint echoes that lingered in the glade's whispers of laughter, sighs of sorrow, murmurs of long-forgotten dreams. She wasn't a hunter or a healer. Lyrian was a collector, gathering these echoes not with nets or jars, but with a small silver flute she carried, its notes weaving the forest's voices into melodies that seemed to shimmer. Each tune she played was slow, tender, as if she were cradling the past itself. The villagers called her whimsical, said her melodies were fleeting, useless things that vanished with the breeze. Lyrian, make something tangible, they'd whisper, turning back to their work. But she only smiled, her flute pressed to her lips, while the forest pulsed with a gentle hum. One twilight, when the sky was streaked with lavender, and the trees stood still as if holding their breath, something stirred. An echo, clearer than the rest, rose from a glade where a single willow wept over a quiet stream. It wasn't a sound, but a presence, warm and alive, carrying the weight of countless voices. Lyrian played a note, and a voice, soft as falling leaves, spoke from the echo. Lyrian, why do you collect what fades? She paused, the mist curling around her, and answered, because I believe these echoes can soothe, can carry peace to hearts that ache in silence. The echo trembled, as if it understood. Then I'll share my voices, it said. But no, they hold the dreams of all who've walked this forest, and weaving them asks for your trust. That night, the echo gifted Lyrian a single note, a sound so pure it felt like holding a memory. She played it, sensing whispers of forgotten joys, a child's giggle by the stream, a lover's vow under the stars, a traveler's prayer for home. With this note, Lyrian began to weave anew, her flute shaping melodies that lingered, glowing faintly in the era lullaby for the lonely, a hymn for the weary, a chant for those seeking rest. The forest seemed to listen, its leaves swaying to her tunes. Slowly, the village changed. A woodcutter, heavy with grief, heard Lyrian's melody drift through the trees and felt his heart lighten, remembering a forgotten smile. A weaver, sleepless with worry, paused by the stream and caught a tune that brought dreams of calm she hadn't known in years. Lyrian's echoes weren't just sounds. They were alive, carrying warmth and memory to those who heard them. She never wavered. Twilight after twilight, she wandered the glades, her flute singing, her melodies glowing brighter. Sometimes the voice returned, teaching her to weave deeper dreams, softer hopes. Each note you play, it said, is a thread of comfort you give the world. Lyrian's heart grew lighter, her hands steadier, knowing her melodies touched souls she'd never meet. She sought no reward, only the quiet joy of knowing her echoes eased someone's burden, somewhere in the stillness of night. And so, the forest bloomed with unseen songs, the trees sang softly, and the villagers, once so heavy, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle hum of Lyrian's echoes. Her melodies still drift, woven through the forest, crafted with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the streams whisper cradle you, and know that, as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already softening, already healing. The keeper of Titsin, a rugged cove, where the sea crashed against cliffs of black stone, and gulls cried like voices from forgotten dreams, lived therein. A man with salt-streaked hair and eyes that mirrored the shifting blues of the ocean. He was unlike the fishermen of the nearby hamlet, who spent their days hauling nets and mending boats under the weight of endless toil. Theron walked the shoreline, his boots sinking into wet sand, his hands tracing patterns in the tide pools, as if the sea whispered secrets only he could hear. He wasn't a sailor or a merchant. Theron was a keeper, not of ships or cargo, but of the tides themselves, guiding their ebb and flow with a staff carved from driftwood, its tip glowing faintly, like a captured moon. Each movement he made was slow, deliberate, as if he were dancing with the rhythm of the waves. The villagers called him peculiar, said his work was pointless, that the sea answered to no one. Theron, tend to real things, they'd grumble, turning back to their nets, but he only smiled, his staff stirring the water, while the cove hummed with a quiet pulse. One evening, when the sky burned crimson and the waves shimmered like liquid fire, something shifted. A tide pool, nestled in a crevice of stone, began to glow, its water rippling with a light that felt alive. Theron knelt beside it, and a voice, soft as the lapping of waves, rose from the depths. Theron, why do you guide my tides? He paused, the sea's breath cool against his skin, and answered, because I believe your waters can heal, can carry peace to hearts worn by storms. The tide pool's glow deepened, as if it understood. Then I'll share my current, it said. But no, it holds the hopes of all who've touched this sea, and guiding it asks for your faith. That night, the tide pool gifted Theron a droplet of light, a tiny orb that felt like holding a wave's heartbeat. He held it close, sensing whispers of ancient longings a sailor's dream of home, a child's wish for wonder, a widow's prayer for calm. With this droplet, Theron began to guide the tides anew, his staff weaving patterns that shaped the waves into forms that lingered, a path of foam leading to shore, a crest curling like a lullaby, a tide carrying a lost hope home. The cove seemed to breathe with him, its waters swaying to his rhythm. Slowly, the hamlet changed. A fisherman, heavy with years of empty catches, saw Theron's glowing tide and felt a spark of strength to sail again. A young girl, afraid of the night, stood by the shore and watched a wave lullaby, dreaming of stars she hadn't feared before. Theron's tides weren't just water. They were alive, carrying comfort and memory to those who lingered. He never faltered. Evening after evening, he walked the shore, his staff dancing, his tides glowing brighter. Sometimes the voice returned, teaching him to guide deeper hopes, softer dreams. Each wave you shape, it said, is a ripple of peace you give the world. Theron's heart grew lighter, his hands steadier, knowing his tides touched souls he'd never meet. He sought no reward, only the quiet joy of knowing his waves eased someone's burden somewhere under the starlit sea. And so, the cove sang with gentle tides, the waves whispered softly, and the villagers, once so weary, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle pull of Theron's tides. Kyr's waves still flow, lapping at the shore, woven with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the sea's rhythm cradle you, and know that, as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already softening, already healing. The Weaver of Shadowzine, a hushed valley where twilight lingered longer than day, and fireflies wove patterns in the air like forgotten constellations. Live Ed Vera, a woman with deft hands and eyes that shimmered like the edge of dusk. She was, unlike the villagers in the nearby hollow, who filled their days with the clatter of looms or the glow of hearths, their lives tethered to the rhythm of survival. Vera roamed the valley's edges, her steps silent on the moss, her fingers tracing the shadows cast by ancient oaks, as if they held stories only she could see. She wasn't a farmer or a storyteller. Vera was a weaver, not of cloth or thread, but of shadows, shaping them into fleeting tapestries that danced in the half-light silhouettes of deer grazing, rivers flowing, hearts entwined. Each movement of her hands was slow, deliberate, as if she were stitching the night itself. The villagers called her strange, said her shadow weavings were useless, dissolving with the dawn. Vera, craft something solid, they'd mutter, turning back to their tasks. But she only smiled, her fingers gliding through the dark, while the valley pulsed with a quiet hum. One evening, when the sky was a deep indigo and the shadows grew thick like velvet, something stirred. A shadow, darker and softer than the rest, curled around an oak, its edges glowing faintly like a moonlit mist. Vera reached out, and a voice, gentle as a whisper in the dark, spoke from within. "Vera, why do you weave what fades?" She paused, the cool air brushing her skin, and answered, "Because I believe these shadows can comfort, can carry hope to hearts lost in fear." The shadow's glow softened, as if it understood. "Then I'll share my essence," it said. "But no, my shadows hold the dreams of all who've walked this valley, and weaving them asks for your heart." That night, the shadow gifted Vera a wisp of darkness, a thread so fine it felt like holding a sigh. She cradled it, sensing whispers of forgotten wishes, a child's dream of safety, a traveler's longing for rest, a mourner's wish for peace. With this thread, Vera began to weave anew, her hands shaping shadows into forms that lingered longer. Glowed brighter a meadow where worries dissolved, a path leading to calm, a star guiding a weary soul. The valley seemed to breathe with her, its oaks swaying to her silent rhythm. Slowly, the hollow changed. A weaver, burdened by endless work, saw Vera's shadow meadow and felt a lightness she hadn't known since youth. A boy, scared of the dark, watched a shadow star and slept without fear for the first time. Vera's tapestries weren't just shapes. They were alive, carrying warmth and memory to those who lingered. She never wavered. Evening after evening, she roamed the valley, her hands weaving, her shadows glowing softer. Sometimes the voice returned, teaching her to shape deeper dreams, gentler hopes. "Each shadow you weave," it said, "is a thread of solace you give the world." Vera's heart grew lighter, her hands steadier, knowing her work touched souls she'd never meet. She sought no praise, only the quiet joy of knowing her shadows eased someone's burden. Somewhere in the stillness of twilight. And so, the valley bloomed with unseen forms. The shadows danced gently, and the villagers, once so weary, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same soft glow of Vera's shadows. Her tapestries still drift, woven through the twilight, crafted with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the valley's hush cradle you, and know that as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already softening, already healing. The singer of rains in a rolling highland where emerald hills met skies, heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and heather, lived Riven, a man with a soft voice and eyes that gleamed like raindrops caught in sunlight. He was unlike the shepherds and tinkers of the nearby glen, who filled their days with the bleating of flocks or the clink of tools, their lives bound by the weight of toil. Riven wandered the hills, his cloak dusted with mist, his ears tuned to the patter of rain, as if each drop carried a story only he could hear. He wasn't a herder or a craftsman. Riven was a singer, not of ballads or hymns, but of rains, his voice weaving melodies that seemed to call the clouds closer, their notes falling like gentle showers. Each song he sung was slow, tender, as if he were coaxing dreams from the sky. The villagers called him fanciful, said his songs were useless, that rain fell without his help. Riven, sing something practical, they'd mutter, turning back to their work. But he only smiled, his voice rising softly, while the highland hummed with a quiet rhythm. One dusk, when the sky was a quilt of gray and gold, and the air trembled with the scent of coming rain, something shifted. A single raindrop, brighter than the rest, fell into a hollow of stone, its surface shimmering like a tiny star. Riven knelt beside it, and a voice, gentle as a drizzle, spoke from within. Riven, why do you sing to me? He paused, the mist cool against his face, and answered, because I believe your rains can soothe, can carry peace to hearts heavy with storms. The raindrops' glow deepened, as if it understood. Then I'll share my song, it said. But no, it holds the dreams of all who've walked these hills, and singing it asks for your trust. That night, the raindrop gifted Riven a note, a sound so pure it felt like holding a breeze. He sang it, sensing whispers of forgotten hopes, a shepherd's wish for rest, a child's dream of wonder, a mourner's prayer for calm. With this note, Riven began to sing anew, his voice shaping rains into melodies that lingered, glowing faintly in the air, a shower washing away sorrow, a drizzle carrying hope, a storm guiding a lost heart home. The highland seemed to sway with him, its hills alive with his song. Slowly, the glen changed. A shepherd, worn by endless days, heard Riven's rain song and felt a lightness he hadn't known since youth. A young girl, restless with fear, stood in the mist and caught a melody that brought dreams of peace she hadn't dared imagine. Riven's rains weren't just water. They were alive, carrying warmth and memory to those who listened. He never faltered. Dusk after dusk, he wandered the hills, his voice weaving, his rains glowing softer. Sometimes the voice returned, teaching him to sing deeper dreams, gentler hopes. Each note you sing, it said, is a drop of solace you give the world. Riven's heart grew lighter, his voice steadier, knowing his songs touched souls he'd never meet. He sought no reward, only the quiet joy of knowing his rains eased someone's burden somewhere under the clouded sky. And so, the highland bloomed with unseen melodies. The rains fell softly, and the villagers, once so hurried, began to pause and dream. As you listen, you might feel that same warmth, that same gentle patter of Riven's rains. His songs still drift, carried by the clouds, woven with care and hope. Close your eyes, let the highland's mist cradle you, and know that, as you drift to sleep, the world within you is already softening, already healing.